Hi, everyone. I'm Arkadiusz Sinowczyk, and today it's my pleasure to talk to Dr. Michael Huemer. Hello, Michael.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Dr. Huemer is a prominent philosopher and professor at the University of California, Boulder, specializing in epistemology, ethics, meta-ethics, and political philosophy. His scholarly contributions include over 80 academic articles and 10 books, making significant impacts in both academic and public philosophical discussions. Dr. Huemer is known for defending several philosophical positions, including ethical intuitionism, direct realism, libertarianism, phenomenal conservatism, and philosophical anarchism. Hello again.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction.
Today, our main topic is inductive reasoning, and especially the problem of induction, which I would say is the problem of theory of knowledge. It's the problem of how can we arrive non-problematically at justified conclusions that don't simply follow deductively from our premises. So let's say we have, for example, Newton's law of gravity, which doesn't follow from any premises on how the planets or daily objects behave. Or when we try to explain the movements of heavenly bodies by use of the Copernican theory, where the theory itself doesn't follow deductively from our premises about what we see in the sky. Today, my aim is to discuss the problem of induction in connection to Dr. Huemer's work, though maybe from a surprising angle, at least to him. When I reached out to have this call, you've sent me two papers of yours that dealt with the topic of induction. And one of the things that struck me was that they dealt with induction in probabilistic terms by invoking probability calculus. And so my opening question would be, what do you think of thinking about induction, solving the problem of induction by invoking probability calculus? What's your general take on the issue?
It's a good idea. Yeah, so okay, so traditionally you say, well, when you make an inference, the premises should support the conclusion in some way. In a deductive inference, the premises should guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Okay, in a non-deductive inference, then the premises should support the conclusion in some other way, not necessarily guaranteeing it. Well, in what way? And the most natural answer to that is, well, the premises should make the conclusion more likely to be true, more probable or highly probable or something like that. And then it turned out that, well, we have like a branch of a field of mathematics that studies probability. It seems like that would be relevant to explaining why the conclusion of a non-deductive inference is more probable given the premises, right? So, let's try that. Yeah.
Yes, so a bit of a background to today's discussion is that in my own research, I focused on developing John Norton's material theory of induction, and I thought that your ideas on phenomenal conservatism have potential huge relevance for developing that theory. And so my background is being a bit skeptical about probabilistic solutions to the problem of induction. And
yeah,
besides things that people point out in the literature, like Peter Ackenstein points out that sheer increase of probability is not by itself increase of evidence. So if we have 1,000th fraction of increase of probability, that doesn't necessarily mean we have increased evidence. But more generally, when Hume spoke about the problem of induction, he pointed out that the solution that we should aim at should not be some highly sophisticated premise or a rule that's available only to specialists. So here we would have mathematicians, philosophers, epistemologists, and instead we should try to account for how our past beliefs, daily beliefs, past scientific conclusions are already justified without trying to justify them retroactively by using some elaborate schema, elaborate algorithm.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Could you explain why an increase in probability doesn't mean an increase in evidence?
So when we speak of increase of probability or decrease, we can have an increase by however close to zero we want. And so there is a certain threshold that evidence has to justify. So when we think that our belief, let's say about how the planetary system looks like, that its probability increased by, let's say, 1 million, it's not enough to say we have more evidence. It's counterintuitive, at least to many ordinary speakers. And one of the challenges to applying probability to scientific investigation is to somehow specify numerically that threshold after which increase of probability becomes more evidence.
So I don't see that would be counterintuitive. So, you made the point that changes in probability can be arbitrarily small, but why wouldn't I think that changes in evidence can also be arbitrarily small? So, there's an extremely small increase in the probability of a theory. Okay, so then there's an extremely small increase in the evidence that we have for the theory. Right. And that change in probability would have to have been caused by something, right? So whatever caused that, wouldn't that be a change in the evidence?
Yeah. So let's take an example of a lottery. Let's say there is 1 millionth of a chance that I will win the lottery. Because let's say this is so. And first of all, it's at least counterintuitive for many people to say that given probability is 1 in a million, that I have evidence that I will win the lottery, that I might win the lottery. We can say I have a certain probability, but many people find it counterintuitive to say that because the probability is 1 in a million, I might win the lottery, or I have something that points out that I will win the lottery. Of course, if the probability was 1.5, then that would be a different topic. But we can, but we can start.
So I would have thought that everyone would say that you might win the lottery.
What if everyone thought that I might win the lottery?
Okay, but I guess it's more questionable that they would say that you have evidence that you're going to win. But I think that might be because sort of like the baseline is where you have a ticket, right? So like you don't have evidence for that ticket as opposed to any of the other tickets winning, right? But if you thought the baseline was not having a ticket at all, you started out with no ticket at all, and then you found out that you had a ticket, then you had evidence that you're going to win, right? But that might seem a little bit odd only because it's an extremely small amount of evidence, right? But okay.
Yeah, and that would be the point that there is some threshold at which increasing probability in a mathematical sense does not lead to increasing evidence. But that's a side point that was to serve as kind of an introduction.
Right. Yeah, that's a bit of a side point.
Yeah. That's
oh, okay. I think maybe maybe one of the issues that you have is whether you can give sort of general abstract rules for assessing inductive inferences. So maybe you're disagreeing about that. And it looks like the Bayesian approach gives you some very general abstract rules that apply to all inferences. And you want to say like, well, no, the cogency of an inference depends upon the details of the particular case. So is that right?
Whether I'm opposed to this in general, no. I see no problem with having some schema that works in simply coming up with some advanced algorithm that allows to analyze inductive inference, and that's especially useful in scientific reasoning where we have to deal with very small fractions of probabilities very often. But my other goal is to account for ordinary reasoners who do not use explicitly the Bayesian reasoning. We can say that the brain works according to those rules, but I'm more interested in how to account for our inductive beliefs being justified without explicit usage of the Bayes theorem. But let's move to another point of the discussion and to elaborate more on the background of today's discussion. So one of the more popular, one of the theories of how induction works and how the problem of induction might be solved is John Norton's material theory of induction. It's an approach that rejects the idea that we need some set of rules to proceed from premises to the conclusion, and instead says that we can proceed directly from the premises to the conclusion without the need of a medium. And one of the problems I have with this theory is that when Norton writes about material inference, direct inference, inference without rules, a skeptic can answer, I don't know what you mean at all. I have no idea what you mean by those descriptions. I simply don't get it. And actually, a couple of inductive skeptics like Karl Popper, at least in some of his writings, when I read his work, his arguments seems to be exactly like the following. I take deductive reasoning as the model of reasoning. Induction is not like deduction. And in the end, I simply can't make sense of a concept like inductive evidence. I can maybe make sense of deductive evidence, but taking deduction as the model, I simply have no idea what you might mean by inductive evidence. And ultimately, I don't think Norton has an answer to this, especially when he says that what he means by inference is not a psychological process. It's a purely logical process. And one of his followers, one of the people who also worked on developing this theory, his name is Andrea Segarra, he explicitly referenced Carnap as kind of reference that if you are asking what do I mean by material inference, things like this, or the metaphysics of inductive inference, go to Carnap, where he has a certain inductive calculus. So in the end, what's the point? We seem to reject the material approach to go back to the ideas where we try to develop some calculus. And so here we have a problem where Norton can't account for what do you mean by that material inference. People since a long time have been trying to solve the problem of induction by developing some calculus, some set of rules. And now you say we don't need that, but what do you mean? What is that? And so I have been looking for some alternatives that might supplement his theory. And so when he speaks of inference being direct, it sounds a lot like there is some kind of direct awareness of the relationship between evidence and the conclusion. But here we are explicitly invoking human minds and psychological phenomena, which Norton tries to avoid. And I thought that one of theories that can be of a solution here is phenomenal conservatism. Where maybe you could give some brief summary of the claims of phenomenal conservatism.
Well, yeah, I mean, the basic idea is justification derives from appearances. So if something seems to you to be the case, then you have reason to think that it is the case, unless you have specific grounds for doubting the appearance. And you can apply this to inference. So you have a premise, and then there's a conclusion that might be supported by it. And to be justified in believing the conclusion on the basis of the premises, you need some kind of appearance. You need some kind of experience in which, when you think about the premise, it seems like the conclusion seems to follow, or it seems like the conclusion would have to be true in light of that premise, something like that. And I think that applies to deductive reasoning as well as inductive and other kinds of reasoning. But I have to say that in your initial explanation there, I don't feel like I understood what the problem was with Norton's view. So you were saying, like, the skeptic would say that they don't know what is meant by a good inductive inference, and why would they claim not to know that? Like, it just means the premise supports the conclusion, or the premise makes the conclusion more likely, or something like that.
Yeah, but what is meant by more likely? What is meant by indicating? What is basically meant by the concept of evidential relationship? And here Norton tries to solve it by speaking of inference without rules. And so, yeah.
So, okay, so like I haven't really read Norton's thing. I just sort of glanced at it briefly, but okay, but I'm getting the idea that, he thinks inferences, you make inference on a case-by-case basis. You don't have general rules or something. But I don't see why that would introduce any more problem than anyone else who believes in inductive inference. So, like, he would just say, well, I just mean what everybody else means, right? What everybody else means when they say cogent inductive inference, that's what I mean.
Yeah, and in general, I agree with this approach at the general level, but the problem is that the skeptic still has comeback to all of this, because Norton, as you said, Norton says that let's go back to Hume's problem, because in the way Hume formulated the problem of induction, he started by saying inference from inductive premises to inductive conclusion is not immediate. You need some kind of a bridge. You need some kind of a bridge, like a principle that future will be like the past, or any kind of other principle. And so since then, people have been trying to develop some set of principles, or one principle that will serve as that bridge between premise and the conclusion.
Yeah.
And here Norton says Hume makes an assumption that connection between premise and the conclusion is not direct. I claim that it is direct. However, the skeptic comes with a mindset that basically adopts deduction as a model for all reason, and then sees a problem with induction because it's not like deduction. It doesn't follow. And so often the skeptical mindset is that they do get how warrant transfers in deduction because conclusion simply follows. But then they say they have no idea how that would work for induction. And so, okay, Norton, you can say that you mean by evidence what everyone means, but we simply question that anyone has any kind of access to that referent of the concept of inductive inference. And when you try to solve the problem of induction by speaking of some inference without rules, we simply have no idea what you are talking about. Okay, we get it that you want to reject rules as a bridge, but when we do so, we are left with nothing, basically, when we try to look at induction. We are simply left with skepticism.
Well, so, I mean, this isn't how I sort of traditionally understand what the problem of induction is. Like, I didn't understand the inductive skeptic traditionally as claiming not to know what probability means, or not to know what cogent inference means. If that's what they say, though, then like I don't see why we're talking about this in connection with Norton's theory, because they would say that to anyone who has any theory about induction. So like they would say that to Carnap, and or they would say that to Bertrand Russell or whatever, like, right? Because those people didn't define probability either, I don't think. And then I guess I would say, well, yeah, okay, if you don't know what probability is, well, first of all, I don't believe that you don't know what probability means, what it means for something to be more probable, because that's an ordinary English word. It's very familiar concept. Okay, but then like if you wanted a theory about it, I would like point to Keynes's theory about logical probability. And then and then maybe we would have to have a debate about whether that's an adequate theory or something.
Yeah, I see that skeptics would not have that problem about meanings with Carnap or any kind of philosopher who adopts a logical view of probability, because they simply explicate how to calculate probability. And that simply gives us the meaning of what Carnap or any other philosopher is talking about. But when Norton speaks about his theory of how inductive inference works, he uses those metaphors or simply says induction without rules. And the skeptic can have a genuine problem of what do you mean by all of that? I hear the words, but there's nothing further. But that's something debatable, and that's something I will try to explain and try to discuss with Norton too when I will meet with him. But now my question is, have you tried to connect the nominal conservatism to induction at length? Because from what I've read in one of your essays, you say that you will say more about inferential justification in connection to phenomenal conservatism in the future work. So has there been any developments? Can you give any snippets?
Yeah, well, so I had a paper called Inferential Appearances. So in earlier work, I was just talking about foundational justification, non-inferential justification. And then, I wanted to extend it to inference. And so, basically, I think like everything that I say about everything, or like everything that any rational person says about everything is in some way underwritten by phenomenal conservatism, because what they're saying, if they're like being rational and not just doing wishful thinking or something, what they're saying is always based upon what seems to them to be the case. And that's true also when you're making inferences. It's just that there's like two kinds of appearances. There's sort of the direct appearance when you think about something and it directly seems true to you. And then there's an inferential appearance when you think about one fact and then something else seems to you to be required in the light of the first thing. Right. So like, yeah, okay. Think about Socrates being a man and all men being mortal. And it just seems to you that in light of those, it would have to be that Socrates was mortal. Right. And so that same thing applies to inductive inferences. Yeah, having said that, though, that doesn't mean that there's not more to say. Right. So like all deductive inferences are underwritten by appearances, inferential appearances. It's also true that we can state the rules of deduction. And when you think about those rules, they're going to seem obviously correct to you. And similarly about inductive reasoning, all inductive reasoning is also underwritten by inferential appearances. Also, you can say some general rules about inductive reasoning, which in my opinion, the correct rules are the laws of probability. And when you think about those are going to seem correct too.
In one of your papers, that about the problem of how to apply probability to particular cases. I'm speaking here of that essay on explanatory priority being the solution to the problem of how to apply the principle of indifference.
Yeah.
I very much like the solution, though a further question arises. Basically, the idea was the principle of indifference tells us that if we have no reason to prefer one hypothesis or the other, we should be neutral to it and therefore assign equal probability to each of the alternatives. And so there arises a certain problem because in different contexts, we can assign this in different ways that will lead us to contradictory estimates of probability. And so your solution in examples like where we are calculating the probability of how a certain phenomenon, which is a consequence of another, will behave, we should start by we should focus on that which is more causal or more explanatory. And you gave some good examples of this, like marbles. I very much like the idea, and the examples go. One can ask, what is the justification of that particular solution? And here, of course, one might refer to the, let's say, intuitiveness of it in particular cases, and especially to phenomenal conservatism or some other kind of theory. And though many people have problems with phenomenal conservatism, I also very like the idea, though have some reservations which are not shared by others, but I'm very curious, what would you say to this? So I think you're invoking by the term sinning something that really exists. There is some type of mental phenomena, which, let's say, in the case where we are looking at the horizon and a ship disappears behind the horizon, we are moved kind of to the conclusion that the Earth is spherical, or there is some kind of experience that indicates that the Earth is spherical. And maybe Norton would say, directly points us to the hypothesis that the Earth is spherical. And even though I think this is a genuine phenomenon, I'm not sure, and this is of course an academic objection. It's not anything else. I have a problem with the term seeming a bit, because the term seeming seems to me kind of too weak to describe what's going on. Because when we speak of that something seems to us, it's almost like it merely seems to us. Whereas where we focus on the experience that we undergo when the ship disappears and we have the conclusion that the Earth is spherical, we are something much stronger seems to be the case. Something, maybe it's almost like an awareness of what's the case, even almost a direct awareness of what's the case. And
Yeah.
this could be especially problematic because the point of the skeptic is often to acknowledge seemings, but not trust them.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I mean, in ordinary language, it sounds too weak to say seems a lot of the time. So, like, if I say, it seems like there's a hand here, that would be weird. Somebody said, hey, do you know how many hands you have? And I go, well, I seem to have two. That would make it sound like I don't really know. And of course, I wouldn't say that. I would say I have two. I would just assert the fact. But I don't think that's because it doesn't, in fact, seem that I have two. It's just that you could say something stronger, and normally you should say something stronger if you can. So I can say I know that I have two, and I do have two hands, and I can see it, and those are all stronger. But it's still true that it does seem like there's two hands. Right. And I would say that about other cases. So the shortest path between any 2 points is a straight line. Like that seems to be true. And when I say that, it might sound like I'm expressing doubt, but it only sounds that way because it's sort of a convention that you're supposed to say the strongest thing that you can, not a weaker thing.
Yeah.
And I can say a stronger thing, which is that I know the shortest path is a straight line. Anyway, okay, I don't know if that makes you feel better about it.
Mhm. Yeah, this is of course, as I said, a kind of academic objection, but we are doing academic philosophy, so let's play. One of another observations that I have is that speaking of seemings might not be a problem when we speak, when we try to say, when we don't want to express full justification, when we don't want to say this is completely justified or this is certain. But as you said, it would be kind of strange to speak, let's say, of the Copernican theory, that it strongly seems to me to be true. And speaking phenomenologically, there is some kind of a cutting point where we no longer want to speak of a theory being probable, but simply being the case, being an established fact. And so even this might not be a certainty in kind of Cartesian approach. It's simply established beyond reasonable doubt. And maybe some other term would be suitable to capture that phenomenological phenomenon where we are no longer suspicious of anything or no longer are fully convinced, it's no longer fully established, but we simply say Paul killed Mary, end of the story.
Yeah. No, that's right. But I mean, I would again just explain this in terms of conversational implicature. So it would be inappropriate for me to say, it's highly probable that the Earth goes around the sun. I shouldn't just say maybe I'm talking to somebody who doesn't yet know. I'm talking to a child or a person from another culture, and they're like, hey, does the sun go around the Earth or does the Earth rotate? I shouldn't say, well, probably the Earth rotates and goes around the sun. And I shouldn't say it's highly improbable that the sun is really going around the Earth. I should just say, no, the sun is stationary. The Earth is rotating. Right. Okay. But the reason for that is not that it would be incorrect. It wouldn't be false to say it's highly probable. It's just misleading because I could say something stronger. Right. Because I'm in a position to assert outright that the Earth is rotating, it's inappropriate for me to merely assert that it's probably rotating. But it is probably rotating. And the probability isn't 1, but it's so close to 1 that in normal context, if I were to say it's not certain, that would be misleading, right? So the grounds for doubt are just like only skeptical scenarios. That's like the only grounds for doubt about that. And so if you were to say to a normal person in a normal context that there's some chance that we might be wrong about that, they would think that there was like some more serious ground for doubt.
Yeah. So this is when we speak in ordinary contexts. But let's say we are speaking in context of academic philosophers when we only want to speak in terms of probability and certainty. How would you respond to an argument that Hume actually presents in his work on induction 2, where he simply starts by claiming that if we speak of probability simply, then that X is probable. Our estimate that X is probable is also probable. And so we need to qualify the initial statement and thereby decrease our initial degree of probability. And of course, we can ask so indefinitely. We can also question the certainty of our estimates, of the estimate of the initial probability.
Yeah. Yeah, this is like David Hume's argument for skepticism about reasoning.
Yes.
But the error in this is thinking that your estimate of the probability decreases every time you estimate okay. So whatever, there's a proposition A, and you ask me how likely I think it is. I say I estimate 90%. Then you go, okay, and now what's your estimate of the likelihood of you being correct that P of A is 90%? And I go 90%. Okay, and then David Hume says, right, or the erroneous skeptic says, oh, so then the probability of A is really down to 0.81. No, where did you get that? Like, why are you multiplying these two things together? There's no basis for that. The probability of the original thing is 0.9, like I told you. Now, I could be wrong that P of A is 0.9, in which case P of A could be higher than 0.9, or it could be lower. It doesn't have to be lower, right? And when I give you the expected value of 0.9, that is already balancing the possibility of it being higher and lower, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Another problem with this Humean approach is that sheer need for that regress. Why can't we simply start with one premise and then go directly to the conclusion? Let's start that infinite regress. Or even if we engage in some kind of infinite regress, why can't we just stop and say, I'm simply aware that this is so. I'm simply aware that the Earth is spherical. But let's move further to the phenomenology of seemings. In your comments to the objections to your analysis of seemings, you mentioned that conceptual analysis usually fails and that we don't need exact analysis to understand by what is meant by seemings. Have you worked in any way on developing further that analysis of seemings?
No. So, somebody asks, hey, Huemer, what do you mean by seeming?
Yeah.
Or appearance? I think so. If somebody actually didn't know what I meant, then the best way of explaining it would be to give examples. So like, okay, I look at this table in front of me. Seems like there's a table. It looks rectangular. Okay, that's an example of appearance. So sensory appearances. And then, okay, I think back to what I ate this morning and whatever. I seem to recall eating an orange or whatever. And so that's another seeming. So I would just give some examples. And then, I think about the trolley problem in ethics, and it seems like you should turn the trolley. Okay, so that's an example of an intuition. And they say, so there's something that all these have in common, where there's a proposition that seems to you to be correct. And okay, so that's what I'm talking about.
And is your goal to develop the analysis at any point in foreseeable future, or are you satisfied with what's the case?
Yeah, that seems fine to me. So, I mean, so part of the reason why I didn't attempt to analyze seems or appears was that no philosopher has ever successfully analyzed anything. And I have another paper about the failure of analysis, right? And about why it is that no one ever succeeded in analyzing anything. But that's a pretty robust fact. I should say there are some philosophers who claim to have themselves analyzed something correctly. So what I should say is, well, there are 0 instances in the history of philosophy where an analysis was generally accepted by philosophers. Right? There are cases where a philosopher claims that his analysis is correct. And in all of those cases, most philosophers think he was wrong. And they claim to have conclusively refuted it. Right?
Yeah.
So, okay. So are we going to correctly analyze seams? I don't think so. Fortunately, we don't need to. Right? Because another thing that we learned from this history is that nobody ever needed an analysis, because we've been going around using concepts and using words and understanding each other for the last whatever, 100,000 years or however long we've had language without having analyses of anything.
Have you, or maybe do you know of anyone who maybe hypothesized that the notion is simply unanalyzable in being a primitive notion? Because that's kind of an alternative that's overlooked here.
Yeah. So is it a primitive notion? And I don't feel like that's exactly the right way to describe it, right? Because on my view, almost nothing has an analysis. And I would make exceptions for some terms in mathematics, right? So like there really is a definition of a square. And so there might be a handful of other terms, right? But basically it's the norm that terms can't be analyzed. So like saying, oh, this is primitive is sort of buying into the framework of like the Lockean conception of concepts in the first place, in which most, like, there's a small number of quote primitive concepts that you got from direct awareness of something, and then other concepts are built out of them. And then you could say, oh, this just happens to be one of the primitive ones. But no, it's just a normal concept. They're all like this, right? Or, almost all the concepts are, there's a cluster of characteristics that tend to go together. Right. And, they're like positively correlated with each other, and nobody decided the exact contours of the concept. Like nobody is determined in the quality space, like exactly where the boundaries around this concept should go. Right.
One of the reasons why I'm entertaining this notion is that when we think of a more general problem than the Humean problem, when we are asked to provide standards of evidence and justification, and then try to do this without invoking any other standards of evidence and justification, one very simple answer is to simply say they are the basis, they are the starting point, and they are simply implicit in that concept that we want to, that concept of seeming or anything else that we want to invoke.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this reminds one of Bertrand Russell's response to the problem of induction, right? That, okay, there's a principle of induction, which, it's going to say something like, if you observe some regularity, you're allowed to assume that it will continue in the future or whatever, something like that. There's a principle of induction, then we just know that a priori. So, okay, so maybe it's just like a self-evident axiom. Well, there have to be some starting points of human knowledge. But whether the starting point should be epistemological claims or logical claims is another question, right? And initially, it seems odd that would be it, right? Because it seems like, we start learning when we're babies, and we don't know any epistemological truths at that time, or logical truths either, right? Like when babies are learning stuff about the world, they don't know facts like such and such is a valid rule of inference. Right? Or they don't know that, appearances justify beliefs in the absence of defeaters. No baby knows that. So it doesn't seem like that's a necessary starting point for knowledge.
Necessary, no, but plausible in terms of when we think about child's development, the child doesn't know any kind of epistemological principles, but has something what many would call seemings or feelings of truth, others would say. And the veridicality of those experiences is simply available while undergoing those experiences. We don't need any kind of elaborate solutions.
Yeah. No, that's right. So like you're allowed to start out by trusting your appearances. So you could say that like a child trusts his appearances. He doesn't believe the principle of phenomenal conservatism because he never heard of it. And like if you ask the kid, he might not even understand what you're saying because it's sort of too abstract. But the kid acts as if it's true. And like, dogs and cats act as if it's true in the sense that when something appears to them to be the case, they believe that that's the case. Right. Okay. So like there has to be some starting point in the sense of you have dispositions to form beliefs in a certain way.
Yeah, and phenomenal conservatism seems to me very well adapted to accounting for how the child and an adult can have justified beliefs without invoking any kind of principle. He simply has certain seemings, things seem to things being a certain way. Those experiences have their veridicality available while undergoing those experiences, and that's the end of the story. Another reason why I'm bringing up the, the possibility that the notion that we try to speak of here is primitive is because when we are trying to explicate that concept itself, we are trying to give some examples, trying to give some descriptions, and then ultimately simply say, see for yourself, check yourself. And it seems like we are kind of going in a circle. And the way to go out of that circle would be simply to say, what we mean by seemings is simply, that concept is simply directly available. It's the basis. But that's definitely very interesting. And if you delve into questioning that whole talk about primitive versus non-primitive notions.
Yeah. So like skeptics would ask, oh, but why are we justified in trusting our appearances? Now give me a justification. But the thing is like, well, you can't really do that in a non-epistemically circular way, right? Because like whatever was the way of forming beliefs, and just stipulate that there was a correct way of forming beliefs. Whatever it is, like a skeptic would say, oh, justify that. And then how are you going to justify using the correct way of forming beliefs? And remember, I stipulate that it's the correct way of forming beliefs. Okay. And how are you going to justify it? Well, you either have to use the correct way of forming beliefs to form the belief that that's the correct way of forming beliefs, or you have to use an incorrect way of forming beliefs to come to the conclusion that that thing was the correct way. You don't want to use the incorrect way, so you have to use the correct one. Okay. And then the skeptic is going to say, oh, that's circular. Okay, but the reason why I said, stipulate that is the correct way is so that you can see that this can't be a correct objection, right? Because, like if there's an objection that would necessarily apply to the correct way of forming beliefs, then it doesn't show that we don't have the correct way of forming beliefs, right? So the correct way of forming beliefs is assuming that things are the way they appear unless you have reason for doubting that. And why should I think that that's the case? Like roughly because that's the way it seems to me. Right. And, there's more to say about it, like, well, I think about these examples of things that seem to be justified beliefs, and then I can think of the appearances that they're based upon. I can think of examples of things that seem like unjustified beliefs. Okay, this is like, wishful thinking or something like that, and they're based on something other than appearances. And okay, but then the skeptic would say, oh, so all of that is based upon the appearances. And yes, that's right. And then they'd be like, oh, so that's circular. And I'd be like, well, that's not really a strong objection, right? Because that would be the objection that you would say to anything, right?
Yeah. when you speak of seemings and justification on the basis of seemings, do you classify this as an a priori justification?
It depends on what the appearance is, right? So there are different kinds of appearances, right? So the distinction between empiricism and rationalism is not that important to a phenomenal conservative. And sort of like the empiricist view just strikes me as arbitrary, because they have the arbitrary view that only some appearances count. So only the appearances that are observational, namely the senses and introspection. And I'm not sure what they would say about memory. Like they've got to accept memory, right? Okay, so introspection, sensory appearances, and memory appearances, you're allowed to use those, but you're not allowed to use intellectual appearances. And to me, that's just arbitrary. Like, well, okay. So, okay, but yeah, the distinction between empirical and a priori beliefs has to do with what kind of appearance is the basis for the belief. So if the appearance just comes from the exercise of the intellect, then it counts as a priori.
What's interesting is that empiricism was supposed to be about having everything based on ultimately direct experience. But since you analyze seemings in terms of certain experiences, rather than, say, dispositions to believe, then seemings are simply under experiences. So why even invoke the distinction between empiricism and rationalism when we are proceeding on the basis of experiences all the way down, basically?
Yeah. So you could say, oh, empiricism is the view that all knowledge rests on experience or something. Intuitions are experiences, so they should accept that. But in fact, they don't. That's just right. That's just not what they mean. They mean it's all based on observation. So the only certain kinds of experiences count for them. They don't count intuitions, right? Which again, in my view, is just arbitrary that they're not counting some experiences.
Yeah, and I think it would be arbitrary precisely because those things, everything here is simply an experience. It's simply an experience and has that feeling or whatever you want to say of veridicality. So that's why it would be arbitrary. Phenomenal conservatism accepts some work of yours have not been that much applied to inferential, non-deductive justification. One of the main attempts to do so, of which I know, is phenomenal explanationism. Do you have any thoughts on that idea?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that they're sort of privileging inference to the best explanation kind of arbitrarily. Like, okay, so there's a kind of reasoning that's inference to the best explanation. Like, okay, like this conclusion seems like it's the best explanation for these premises. But then there's other kinds of reasoning too. So like, like why is explanation playing such a huge role in the theory? Like that seems a bit arbitrary to me.
And it seems too contrived in a way that the central idea is to accept seemings and then say we are justified in believing an idea where we have a corresponding seeming, and the content of that seeming, the belief, is the best explanation of that seeming. While I think one of the main drivers behind phenomenal conservatism is to answer skepticism in a very simple way, and so to analyze the relationship of justification in terms of seemings, in terms of things seeming to me to be a certain way, and thereby to analyze why even such a thing as inference to the best explanation is a valid means of reasoning. And the answer would be because it's based on seemings, because those conclusions seem to me to be true.
Yeah, good. So, So yeah, the explanationist view, like, as you articulated it, is you're justified in believing something if it seems to you to be correct, and the actual truth of the thing is the best explanation for your having that appearance. Yeah, okay. And so, there's an externalist version of this, which is like, the thing has to, in fact, be the best explanation in some like external sense, like, which might include it actually being true or something in a way that would not necessarily be accessible to you, the observer. And like, if that's the view, then I would just have my general objections to externalism. And, like, yeah, I think what you're justified in believing should supervene on your own internal mental states. There shouldn't be two people who have the identical mental state, but one of them is justified and the other one's not. Okay, so then there might be an internalist version of it where the best explanation is sort of, well, it's the best from your point of view. Okay, and then I would ask something like, okay, well, and how would you assess whether it's the best explanation? Okay, and then that's going to involve like making other judgments about it, like, well, it's plausible, and then it renders the evidence more probable or something like that. And then I'm going to say, well, all of those judgments are based upon the appearances, and they're not going to be based upon further judgments about best explanation, right? Otherwise, there's going to be like some kind of infinite regress or something. Okay, so if you're allowed to know directly based on the appearances, something like, so-and-so is a plausible explanation, then you should be able to just know P itself based on the appearances, right? So you don't always have to go through the claim that something is the best explanation.
Yeah, moving into more details on how to apply phenomenal conservatism to inferential justification. It works very well, as many have pointed out, for cases where we are speaking of ordinary agents, not confronted by skeptical challenges. So you're speaking of lack of a certain skeptical reflection. And one of the things that people pointed out is that many hypotheses need to be ruled out at the outset as being worthy of even considering. So maybe some kind of conspiracy theories, or in your work on epistemic possibility, you also spoke on certain explanations being simply not worthy of consideration. And how would you say a phenomenal conservatist would try to solve the problem of which alternatives are relevant and which are not?
I mean, there's probably not a helpful general rule, right, for which alternatives are worthy of consideration, right? And the thing is, like, well, you can't really ask for that, because the question itself is which things you would consider in the first place. So if I have to first like apply an algorithm to tell me that something is not worth considering, that means that I had to consider it. Right? So, which means that I was treating it as worth considering in the first place. So it's got to be something more like it's automatic, right? So you just automatically, your brain automatically excludes the things that are not worth considering. So, okay, and so how does it do that? Well, I don't know. They're the things that you don't have any evidence for, you don't have any reason to suspect, right? And the things that are just sort of like too far from how the world works according to the rest of your belief system or something like that. So, like, a good example, let's say, you're in a jury trial, defendant is on trial for murder, and the defendant is going to hypothesize that maybe the murder was actually committed by a shape-shifting, time-traveling robot, like the robot in the Terminator series, who was disguised as the defendant. Maybe that's what happened, and you can't refute that happened. So you should acquit me. Okay. And then if the person said that, that might be part of an insanity defense, but that would not be taken as, like in the jury room, you should not discuss whether that actually happened. You should not start talking about whether time travel is possible and whether there could be shape-shifting robots or whatever. You should just dismiss that, right? Okay, but it's like, and like if somebody said, "Oh, why am I dismissing that?" You know what? I don't have to answer why I'm dismissing that. Right? Because if I'm answering you, then I'm not dismissing it.
Yeah.
Right? Just
The way I think of this is that when this Terminator hypothesis is brought up, I simply have no relevant, let's say, seeming or nothing. Simply, I have no experience of things pointing in that direction. And then, of course, the skeptic can come back with various arguments like, yeah, great, but what if? What if this was the case? Isn't there a chance of probability? Or that's great, but
well,
if the Terminator case were true, the observational consequences would be the same. And then I think the answer would be simply to discuss what's wrong with those arguments and then simply say, okay, I've answered those arguments, shown why they are wrong, and then I'm back to the case where nothing points in the direction of that hypothesis.
yeah. So, I mean, on the face of it, just saying, "Oh, nothing points in the direction of that," isn't compelling because, like they're not claiming that it is in fact the case. They're just saying it's possible, you can't rule it out. So, okay, so I have no evidence that it's true. They would say, that's right, you have no evidence that it's true, but you also have no evidence that it's not true. So now you have to say you don't know. Okay. Okay, but most people's reaction when they hear that, and like if somebody said this in a courtroom, most people would just laugh at it. So their reaction would be it would be stronger than just, I don't have any experience with that happening. Their reaction would be, that is ridiculous. Right? And like it is worthy of laughter and ridicule. Okay. So there's something like that. So, you could describe that as an appearance, right? An appearance of being unworthy of consideration.
Yeah. Of course, the problem here would be why it is laughable. And of course, we can't simply say that I have nothing experientially indicating that the Terminator is the case. Here we could also add that I have a very strong indication that this is and here I have the problem with the term seeming, because if you are speaking as, let's say we are in the court as academic philosophers, in the end, to say that it simply seems to me that this is a real person is not how we would say. In the end, I think the answer would be something like, I'm simply aware. I'm simply aware. What are you talking about? I have no indication saying otherwise, and I'm simply aware. Why are you bringing this up?
I mean, sometimes it would sound odd to say you're simply aware of the fact. So, okay, so how do you know that there aren't time traveling, shape-shifting robots that impersonate people and then commit crimes? And it doesn't sound right to say exactly, I'm simply aware that there aren't any.
Yeah.
Right? Because how could you be aware of that? What would that awareness be like? Right? Because like the absence of those robots wouldn't cause anything to happen to you.
Yeah. So speaking from kind of Newtonian context, the claim wouldn't be that I'm aware that there aren't any terminators, that I'm simply aware that this is a person. That's all. I'm simply aware of that.
Yeah. So my scenario was, the guy is accused of a crime and he says he didn't do it because a Terminator robot did it instead. Okay, so the guy in the courtroom is a human and he's not claiming to not be a human. He's just claiming that it was the Terminator that people saw, not him. Right?
Oh yeah.
So it would be odd to say, I'm just aware that they saw him and not the Terminator, right?
Yeah. So the response would simply be something like, I'm simply aware that you did it. I'm not aware that
What?
it wasn't Terminator, but given the evidence, I can say nothing else that I'm simply aware. And of course,
Well,
we can try to attack speaking in terms of being aware, because that may seem strange. And that's another reason why I'm trying to entertain the idea that the relevant notion here is so basic that it's unanalyzable, that we can give metaphors only. And
yeah,
ultimately, we can just give examples, as you said.
yeah. I mean, like you wouldn't say you're just directly aware that this guy did it, right?
Yeah,
Um, okay, so then if you're aware of it, it seems like you're aware of it indirectly. And so then somebody could ask, for an explanation of how you're indirectly aware of it. So just walk me through the reasoning, okay? But, like that would be a thing that you could do in a philosophy room. Like, okay, it could be philosophically interesting to epistemologists to try to work through why that hypothesis is not worth considering, right? But if you're like a normal person in an everyday context, you should not do that. You should refuse to entertain it. So you should refuse to continue the discussion. Like, no, I'm not talking about whether it was a Terminator robot. We're not doing that. Let's move on.
yeah.
That's what you should do. Right? Okay. Now, me sitting here theorizing about why you should do that, right? I think the answer is, well, you have a particular kind of appearance, which is the hypothesis strikes you as ridiculous, right? Which is why if you tell stories like this, people commonly laugh. And right, that laughter is a reaction to the ridiculousness. Right. Okay. So, and okay, like everything else in life, it's this is based on appearances, and you go with the appearances unless you have a reason to think otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. So until somebody gives you evidence that that Terminator robots are actually a reasonable possibility, you just go with the appearance that it's ridiculous and not worth considering.
The last question that I would like to touch upon, again, in the connection with the material theory of induction and phenomenal conservatism, is that I referred to seemings as one of the ways in which the gap between inductive premises and conclusion could be reached directly. Many people object to Norton that if inference is direct and not based on some kind of elaborate algorithm, he can give no guidance to the researcher or to ordinary reasoner as to how he should choose his beliefs. And what I find interesting is that this objection that how one can be irrational has been also pointed at phenomenal conservatism, and that you have answered it in an interesting way. You maybe summarize a bit how can we be irrational if evidence is basically seemings?
Oh yeah. You might sort of wonder, yeah, don't people always base their beliefs on what seems to them to be the case? So then how is a belief ever not justified on this view? Then, you might be inclined to think, oh, well, there's this defeaters clause that says like you could have grounds for doubting your appearances and then you shouldn't believe them or something. But then you might be like, yeah, but the defeaters themselves come from appearances. So like, if a person has defeaters that are appearances, then why would they not believe those? Okay, so you're wondering like, well, yeah, why would any belief ever be unjustified? Right. But like my basic view is, well, there are other mental states that people have that affect their beliefs. Commonly, desires can affect people's beliefs. So people could want to believe something, and that could influence what they wind up believing. Okay. Now, you can't just believe whatever you want just at will. You can't just believe any proposition at will. Right. But if you have a case where the evidence is sort of mixed, there's ambiguous evidence, there's like some evidence for and some evidence against. Um, and you also have like a strong desire to believe one side, then you can get yourself to believe that one side, right? And with the same evidence, somebody who had the desire to believe the other thing could get themselves to believe the other thing, right? So there's this sort of like partial control of your beliefs. Like, if it's not too obviously wrong and you want to believe something, you can get yourself to believe it, right? That was the idea.
Yes, so we could refer to non-formal norms like not based on one's beliefs on emotions, or there are many other non-formal norms that we could invoke. I think it's a good plan. Thank you so much for agreeing to speaking with me for a bit today. It's been a true pleasure to talk to you.
Right. Thanks for having me. It's been great talking to you.